So we talked about the subtleties of a meat diet and the environmental footprints. This is a paper that just came out that looks at how different aspects of food production, different impacts of food production, like water use, perturbation to land, and nutrients, etc., add up to environmental footprint. And this looks at one particular year to focus on a more comprehensive picture. So reading the abstract to start with, feeding humanity puts enormous environmental pressure on our planet, very obvious. These pressures are unequally distributed, yet we have piecemeal knowledge of how they accumulate across marine, freshwater and terrestrial ecosystems. Here we present global geospatial analysis detailing greenhouse gas emissions, freshwater use, habitat disturbance and nutrient pollutions generated by 99% of total reported food production of aquatic terrestrial foods in 2017. So remember, it's 1 year, but it's quite comprehensive. We further rescale and combine these four pressures to map the estimated cumulative pressure or footprint of food production. On land, we find 5 countries contribute nearly half of food cumulative footprint. Aquatic systems produce only 1.1% of food, but 9.9% of the global footprint. Which pressures drive these footprints vary substantially by food and country. Importantly, the cumulative pressure per unit of food production, so-called efficiency, varies spatially for each food type, such that ranking of foods by efficiency differ sharply among countries. So we have seen elsewhere in drawdown, for example, how environmental footprints of meat is much higher than vegetables or plant-based diets, but here there is additional details that are interesting to look at. These disparities provide the foundation for efforts to steer consumption towards lower impact foods and ultimately the system-wide restructuring essential for sustainably feeding humanity. I am not a big believer that behavioral change on such large scales is possible. Humongous incentives will be needed. Plus, there are cultural issues of switching diets or why there are preferences for diets. Whaling, for example, is still continued by countries like Japan and Norway because they say that's their culture and people eat various kinds of meat, and there are many cultures that are purely vegetarian, but with economic growth they tend to move more towards fish and meat and so on and so forth. So behavioral issues are complicated, but nonetheless, looking at the cumulative impacts, so this is the cumulative pressure for each food type, looking at greenhouse gas for that particular food and the total greenhouse gas, water used against total water used, nitrogen and phosphorus versus total, and habitat disturbance versus the total disturbance for all food production. High total cumulative pressure can arise from high pressure per unit production or large amounts of food production or together. To disentangle this, we calculated a metric of efficiency E by summing the cumulative pressure Cp for each food type F and country C and dividing by the unit of production measured as weight tons, protein content in edible kilograms, or energy content in kilocalories, such that efficiency for country C for food type F is cumulative pressure Cp for C and F divided by UP for C and F. Okay, so let's look at a few figures to get a better sense. I don't know, I can't talk today. This is a schematic view of methods used to assess and map cumulative pressures from food production. Pathways within the hashed box here illustrate possible future research that's outside the scope of the study here. Icons adopted from canva.com. So completed in this study, looking at livestock, aquaculture, crops and fisheries. So looking here at impacts in terms of manure, feed, land use and infrastructure, water consumption, enteric fermentation, so that could lead to methane emissions, excretion, feed, infrastructure. For crops you have fertilizers and pesticides, land use and infrastructure, field maintenance and harvesting, water consumption and residues, biomass, vessel use and harvest for fisheries. So you can see how the various impacts in terms of greenhouse gases, habitat disturbance, nitrogen and phosphorus, nutrient perturbations and water use are seen here. And for aquaculture, crops and fisheries, so you can see fisheries has high impact on GHGs and disturbance of habitats, 1.1% of the total food production, but almost 10% of the total cumulative pressure. If you look at how they would act in turn onto cumulative, so distribution of cumulative footprint, identification of high pressure locations, these are for future research, contribution of food, so this is completed here, we'll see some maps, contribution of foods to spatial cumulative footprint, but future directions could involve environmental change, including climate change, sea level rise, ocean acidification, habitat species loss, habitat loss and species loss, eutrophication, surface and groundwater depletion, and so on. And impacts could include economic, health, human displacements and populations, food security, and various impacts on other species and so on. Looking at the number of raster cells of cumulative pressure in millions of units of millions, you can see how the distribution is skewed here. So you have number of raster cells in 10 to the 4. So here are 0.6 going up to 5.9. So this is proportion of global pressures in millions for the top 1%. And the main thing to notice is that the breadbasket of the US and the heavy agricultural areas of western US and the Mississippi watershed here, large parts of Europe, northern Africa, Central Africa here, or the Western Africa, India and China light up, so do some parts of Indonesia and Southeast Asia and so on. So obviously these have to be understood in terms of efficiencies that we mentioned as well. Looking at individual impacts, disturbance in terms of square kilometer equivalents, again India and China light up with large parts of Canada, US, Europe, Africa and South America, and Indonesia here as well. In terms of nutrients, you can see again India and China light up, but so do African countries, European countries, parts of Central America, South America and so on. This is in tons of phosphorus and nitrogen. Water, so this is in 1,000 meter cubes, so large water use impacts in China and India, and Europe and US. And finally, greenhouse gas emissions, China and India light up again when you look at CO2 equivalent. So you have to be careful because non-CO2 greenhouse gases have been converted using global warming potential and so on. So I'm being brief just because we want to see the maps and see where the high impacts are cumulatively, and as well as the each category defined here as habitat disturbance, nutrients, water and greenhouse gases. If you look at spatial overlap of the top 1% greatest pressure values for each of the 4 dominant pressures from food production, here it's looked at as 1 overlap, twice the overlap, times 3 overlap, times 4 overlap. It's just a way of looking at overlap of disturbances in terms of or pressures in terms of cumulative habitat disturbance, greenhouse gases, nutrients, water, and here 2 times the overlap, 3 times and 4 times the overlap. And bad news again is that India here, parts of India show up heavily in terms of 4 times the overlap of disturbances, 3 times, and as well as other lower scales of 1 times the overlap. Obviously, this is not good news, especially for a country with limited area, limited resources, monsoon being decreasing over the last several decades, extremes increasing, droughts, aerosols, deforestation, everything matters. So that's something to be kept in mind, and maybe it will help India in terms of planning for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and overall environmental impact of its food production industry. Looking further into proportional contributions to the cumulative footprint in the highest ranking countries, so there are various details here. So this is looking at land and ocean in terms of those each pressures: disturbance, greenhouse gas, nutrients, and water. Again, China and India top the list down here, with Ukraine, Bangladesh, Canada, and so on down to United States, Brazil, Pakistan, Indonesia, Russia, Iran, etc. So obviously countries which have very little water and export a lot of their foods at the cost of their own environmental degradation have to be careful. So A and B here are looking at proportional contribution to the cumulative footprint in the highest ranking countries for each pressure summed across all food types, or each type of food summed across 4 pressure classes. So here we are looking at different types of food across each pressures being added. Again, China and India top here, with crops and human consumption being a large part of the proportional contribution to the cumulative pressures. There are other details here. So stacked bars show the proportional contribution of marine calculated as the exclusive economic zone where a lot of the fishing happens, and terrestrial with darker colors, pressures from all foods combined. Symbols indicate the proportion of global food production, excluding feed for livestock, for each country as measured by tons in circles, protein in triangles, and kilocalories in squares. So the efficiency factors include those things. So message is still the same, that everybody is adding, but some countries are doing much more of the proportional contribution to global measure of food production pressures. This is for 1 year, so you have to be also careful how that may have played into it in terms of weather conditions being good or bad, more groundwater mining if it was a dry year, and so on and so forth. Okay, now looking at proportion of total global cumulative environmental pressure for each food type, broken down by classes of pressure. Again, not going into details, you are looking at livestock, crops, meat and marine and freshwater fisheries, and mariculture. And these are the color codes for the pressures for food and other direct pressures. So again, here you can see that pig meat ends up at the top, with cattle, cow milk, etc. coming down here, and similar numbers are carried over because the scales are not the same. Here it's up to 0.15, 0.1, 0.012, and so on. So it's important to carry this equivalent scales across different types of foods. So here rice tops the list with wheat on the second, then you have various food types down to sugar beet, soybeans, and so on here. And for marine and freshwater fishes, you have demersal, large pelagic, medium pelagic, reef, benthic, forage, etc. And for mariculture, shrimp is a big item. Countries like India and China export a lot of their mariculture shrimp to the Western world. Marine fish general, salmonoids, bivalves, crustaceans, and tuna, and so on. You can of course look at this in terms of environmental efficiency or inefficiency, because as you remember, I hope I showed it, it's CP, so cumulative pressure for country for food type, divided by the unit of production in either measured as protein content, energy content, or the weight itself of the productivity. And if you look here at the livestock, marine and freshwater fisheries and mariculture, again, higher the number, more inefficient is a particular food type in terms of cumulative pressures per unit of energy or weight of total production or kilocalories. And again, these numbers are carried across, so you can see that corresponding to high environmental footprint, you have livestock being more inefficient compared to some of the fisheries, and compared to mariculture, and also compared to crops. Not surprising, but good to keep in mind. And here some countries are specifically drawn out in terms of the big contributors. So US, Russia, India, Brazil, China, and Indonesia top the list. So food production in general remains inefficient in that sense of how we get calories or weight of grains or whatever else, the weight of the food versus proteins. But we have already said how a vegetarian diet, a vegan diet, is much more friendly to the environment than meat diet, which makes sense because to eat meat, to produce 1 calorie of beef, you have to feed the cows a lot, give them a lot of water, they use a lot of land for grazing and so on. Even when there is concentrated feed, they are fed all kinds of things at very high environmental cost. So keep those things in mind, and if you're able to switch your diet, reduce meat consumption, it is important to do that. But remember that it's better to carry kind of a portfolio approach, because you could be riding your bicycle and eating so much meat that you would be having a bigger overall carbon footprint than somebody who is driving an SUV but is a vegan. So you have to see where your carbon footprint comes from, how much you fly in a year, and so on and so forth. So this always gets complicated, but nonetheless it's important to keep the contributions to the environmental footprint from food production based on food types, food where they are produced by country, and the various disturbances, various pressures like habitat disturbance, greenhouse gases, water use, and nutrient perturbations. Okay, let's leave it here for now.